This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it is Wednesday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. In this one, we're going to be looking at a creature type, Construct. Construct is not a creature type that has been around forever. It first appeared in Dissension, which was released in 2006. Then, with the Grand Creature Type update, some older creatures were errata to carry this creature type. Constructs are predominantly artifact creatures who differ from golems in that they are created through mechanical means. Golems, meanwhile, are created through magic. On average, constructs are quite powerful, coming in at number 4 on my top 10 on the best creature types in the game, and that's what got me interested in doing a deeper dive on the creature type. In total, there are 145 cards that either carry the construct creature type, can become construct creatures, or create construct tokens. In this video, we're going to look at the 10 of these that have had the most success in competitive Magic. Before we get started, a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. Pro Tour and Mythic Championship, as well as Legacy and Vintage Championship top 8s are worth 2 points, and a Grand Prix top 8 is worth 1 point. Now, let's move to our list. At number 10 is Arcbound Worker, which is one of those older cards to be retroactively given the construct creature type. When the Worker came out in Darksteel, lots of artifact creatures simply didn't have a creature type, so originally the Worker didn't have one. These days though, it is a construct, so it is eligible for this list. The Worker comes with the modular mechanic, which allows it to put its +1/+1 counters elsewhere when it dies. While less well known than fellow modular creature Arcbound Ravager, Arcbound Worker works quite well in conjunction with the Ravager. Between that and being a cheap artifact, Arcbound Worker fit perfectly into the affinity decks that briefly dominated both block and standard before being banned into oblivion. It would go on to see play in extended affinity decks, but for a long time it was not a part of the modern affinity decks, which have been top tier in the format since it began back in 2011. But recently, affinity decks in Modern have moved towards a more +1/+1 counter-centric strategy using hardened scales, and these days, the Worker is back hanging out with Arcbound Ravager. As a result, Arcbound Worker will continue to add to its score, and it has a real chance to move up this list. At number 9, I have Corrin, Scion of Urza, a planeswalker who makes construct creature tokens. Corrin is the newest card to make the list, but despite being relatively new, he's already seen play in multiple formats. Corrin does the two things that often make for great planeswalkers. He draws you cards, and he can protect himself with creature tokens, in this case, those construct tokens, who get larger the more artifacts you have. In Standard, he has been a nice value engine, but hasn't really appeared in very many decks loaded up with artifacts to fully take advantage of that ability. Even if the constructs aren't at their best, though, Corrin does a lot for 4 mana in Standard. In Modern, he really only sees play in decks that run lots of artifacts, like Tron and Affinity. In Legacy, he has done the most so far in Eldrazi decks, who are very happy to have a cheap planeswalker that they can play without having to delve into colored mana. In Vintage, he has seen some play in Paradoxical Outcome combo decks, which are also very focused on artifacts. Corrin is going to continue to climb up this list, since he still has some legality left in Standard, and is also actively being played in multiple formats. At number 8, we have Verdurous Gearhulk, which is part of a cycle of mythic rare constructs from Kaladesh. They are all colored artifacts that have a color-appropriate keyword and do something also color-appropriate when they come into play. The Gearhulk comes down and puts +1/+1 counters all over the place. If he is the only creature in play, the worst you're going to do is a 5-mana 8/8 with Trample, but the fact that he can come down and put those counters on other creatures, immediately changing the board state, is what really made him good while he was in Standard. This was further augmented by the fact that there was a +1/+1 counter-centric deck in the format, loaded up with payoffs for having counters, most notably Winding Constrictor. It has never put up any points since rotating out of Standard, and it seems unlikely to, even though Affinity these days is an artifact deck that does stuff with +1/+1 counters. This Gearhulk is probably a little too clunky for modern hardened scales decks. At number 7, we have Torrential Gearhulk, which is, obviously enough, part of the same cycle as Verdurous Gearhulk. It is the only other Gearhulk to have made this list. This Gearhulk comes with Flash and the ability to cast instants from your graveyard for free. While it wasn't Standard, it was a staple for control decks, where it often served as a win condition that could also recast the best spell in your graveyard for free. The fact that the Hulk can come down with Flash, block something smaller and kill it, and then cast a spell means it really isn't all that hard to get a 3-for-1, and that's exactly what control decks want to be doing. Unlike Verdurous Gearhulk, Torrential Gearhulk has seen some play in Modern, where it is featured in some Jeskai control decks. though it hasn't exactly caught fire in that format, having put up a total of 4 points between 2016 and 2018. It has at least proven that it can get it done there, so it seems likely it will put up at least some points in the format going forward. At number 6 is Beaumont Courier. As a 1-drop, the Courier brings a lot of value. A 1-mana 1/1 with haste can get in for some damage early, but what really makes the Courier nice is the fact that it can reload your hand in the later part of the game. Red aggro decks often struggle with finding a way to not run out of gas if they get slowed down at all, and the Courier gives your deck a second wind, assuming it got in for a few damage early, by giving you some extra cards that could help you push through the last few damage. So far, the Courier has mostly seen play in Standard, where it's featured prominently in aggro decks, especially those running some minor artifact synergy. Earlier this summer, it also earned its first point in Modern, appearing in the sideboard of a Hogak Dredge deck. Since it discards your hand for you, it works well with Hogak because it helps load up your graveyard. That deck is a little less interested in using the Courier to reload your hand, and more interested in just stocking up the graveyard. There's a chance that the Courier sees play in other Modern decks at some point, like Affinity, but since Affinity decks have moved towards +1/+1 counter-centric strategies, it seems kind of unlikely right now, since Beaumont Courier doesn't bring any +1/+1 counters to the table. At number 5, we have Steel Overseer, a construct who can put +1/+1 counters on all your constructs and, well, also all other artifact creatures too. If you can build a board that goes wide with artifact creatures, the Overseer drastically speeds up the clock, helping you win the game incredibly quickly. While the Overseer only managed a single point in Standard, he went on to become a staple in one of Modern's most consistently powerful decks, Affinity. Affinity decks have been Tier 1 since the format began in 2011, and they still are today. The Overseer worked well in older Affinity decks, but with the recent innovation of the Hardened Scales Affinity deck we've mentioned several times already in this video, he's even more insane. The deck is loaded up with creatures who already have +1/+1 counters and can use them for various purposes, like Arcbound Ravager, and 2 other cards we're going to see further up on this list. So, in addition to just making your board big, the Overseer helps the deck operate on a more combo-oriented axis as well. The Overseer also sees play in Ravager Shops decks and Vintage, which run a lot of the same creatures as modern Hardened Scales Affinity decks do, so the Overseer fills the same role there. The deck is just even more explosive thanks to fast mana. Additionally, with a recent reprint in Core Set 2020, I think the Overseer has an outside shot to improve on its 1 point in Standard. For that to happen though, one of the next couple sets will need to have a pretty heavy artifact theme. Still, without adding points in Standard, the Overseer is going to continue to amass points in both Modern and Vintage. At number 4, we have Mem Knight, a construct who doesn't cost any mana. Sure, a regular old 0-mana 1/1 wouldn't be that good in a vacuum. 1/1s are just outclassed way too quickly. There are plenty of 1-drops that will immediately make it so Mem Knight can't attack. But the Mem Knight comes with the benefit of being an artifact which drastically improves its value. In Standard, it was played in Tempered Steel decks where it quickly became a 0-mana 3/3. It has found the most success in Modern, though, where it has appeared, like many cards on this list, in Affinity decks. The deck seeks to just play every card in its hand as quickly as possible, and then do tons of damage to the opponent with the help of things like Steel Overseer or Cranial Plating, and the Mem Knight plays right into those plans. One thing going against Mem Knight, though, is something we've mentioned, again, several times in this video. Affinity decks in Modern have moved towards being all about +1/+1 counters, and Mem Knight doesn't bring as much value to that sort of deck, so 2019 hasn't been the best year for Mem Knight compared to cards like Steel Overseer and Arcbound Worker. I wouldn't count it out completely on finding success in the future, as it's likely Affinity decks change again at some point. And number 3 is Hangerback Walker, a construct that makes Thopters when it dies. The Walker is powerful because you can play it anywhere on your curve, and it is likely to give you some serious value, since for every +1/+1 counter on it, you're going to be getting a Thopter when it dies. Of course, it can also increase the +1/+1 counters on itself to make that even more of a problem. Hangerback Walker is one of the big reasons that Affinity has transformed into Hardened Scales Affinity. While Arcbound Ravager has always been in Affinity decks, the addition of Hangerback Walker, along with a card further up on this list, has gone a long way towards making those decks interested in counters. Just imagine what you can do with this in Arcbound Ravager, for example. You can sacrifice the Walker and a bunch of tokens, and then sacrifice the Ravager to itself, and use Modular to give yourself a lethal Thopter or other creature. That's just one of many things you can do with Hangerback Walker in the Hardened Scales deck. It also sees play in modern Tron decks, which can quickly cast it as a pretty large creature. The Walker was also heavily played while in Standard because its resilience made it a great card, and for a while, it was shoved into just about any creature-based deck as a result. Like Steel Overseer, it also sees play in Vintage Ravager Shops decks. It figures to continue to put up points in both Vintage and Modern in the coming years. At number 2, we have Scrap Heap Scounger. Between having nice aggressive stats as a 2-mana 3/2 and refusing to stay dead, the Scounger was a great card for standard aggro decks, with mini decks actually splashing black just so they could bring back their Scrap Heap Scounger. A creature with 3 power who doesn't stay dead is no joke, because there just won't be a ton of creatures, especially in the early part of the game, that are capable of blocking it and surviving, and that makes trading with it pretty miserable. It was one of the most played cards in Standard while it was there, helping enable especially Rakdos aggro decks, which also ran a few other artifact synergies, along with fellow construct Beaumont Courier. Unlike the Courier, the Scounger's future in non-rotating formats seems less clear, and so far, it has all of its points in Standard. And at number 1 is Walking Ballista, another construct who likes +1/+1 counters, who has helped lead to the dominance of artifact decks in both Modern and Vintage. It has many similarities to Hangerback Walker, including the fact that it has the same mana cost and it can add additional counters to itself, as well as the fact that both can really find extra value in +1/+1 counters. The Ballista is another card that can function as a combo piece, since it can help lead to utterly devastating turns in Modern Affinity and Vintage Ravager shops, because if you're able to move a bunch of counters onto the Ballista, it can unload them immediately for lethal damage out of nowhere in a deck like Hardened Scales Affinity or Ravager shops. Like the Walker, it also sees play in modern Tron decks. Also like the Walker, it was as close as you could get to a staple in Standard, appearing in decks there that cared about +1/+1 counters, but also in more traditional aggro and control decks. It is just hard not to get a good deal out of this creature, who in addition to functioning as a burn spell, can also work as a removal spell since it can do damage to creatures by unloading counters too. Unlike Hangerback Walker, Walking Ballista also sees play in Legacy, where it's been played in Eldrazi aggro decks. I don't imagine that the Ballista will ever relinquish its spot, especially because the 2 cards that are kind of close to it and are actively putting up points, the Hangerback as well as Steel Overseer, see play alongside it in most cases. Well, that does it for this edition of MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to see the 200 other MTG Top 10s I've already done, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.